The biggest pain point with a lot of our clients in any sort of security realm is just knowing what they have and securing it all. And it's a foundational concept to security configuration management, because security configuration management can't really work effectively if you don't know what you have.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's episode of Hive Live. I'm Alex Netty, and thanks for joining us for this masterclass about asset and configuration management for your organization. If you've been following us here on our YouTube channel, make sure you follow us across all our other social media channels so you don't miss out on our hot takes on cybersecurity news, our latest in-depth research, and free guides developed by our experts. Today, though, we're talking about security configuration management, or SCM. It's a topic that comes up all the time at organizations, and it's a critical component of many cybersecurity frameworks. IT and cybersecurity practitioners are constantly grappling with the question, what hardware and software do we have, and how do we secure it? So what are the best approaches and resources that are available to you and your team? How can you pragmatically tackle your SCM problem without spending a lot of time and money? And more importantly, where should you start? Well, to talk more about it and talk more about it in depth today, I have cybersecurity expert and longtime asset and configuration management practitioner, Andrew Bradley, with me. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks, Alex. Yep. So one of the biggest topics that we always discuss with a lot of our clients and a lot of prospective clients is configuration management. So I figured I'd come in here today and just enlighten some people, some people who have questions, anybody who's got some burning interest in the topic, and we can start from there.
Yep. And I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle. One of the biggest things that we always start with, and whether they see this in a framework or how they're handling this in general, the word du jour is SCM, security and configuration management. What is it at a high level, Andrew?
Yeah, so security configuration management is really like your organizational control over all of your assets, all of your software, all of your information systems, is defining the operating state that they're supposed to be operating at or running at in your environment. And there's a whole process involved with getting to that, sort of what we call the baseline state. And that's where security configuration management is really important. It's identifying, all the things you have in your environment, what you need to do to secure them, whether that's specific configuration settings, applying patches, certain changes, or just managing and monitoring them. Everything you've got to do to make sure that they are running at an approved state that makes operational sense for you and your business mission. Sometimes there's some federal requirements or some industry security frameworks and requirements that come into play here, but a lot of it really just has to do with what your organization needs out of your information system components and how they need to be configured and managed and monitored to meet that business mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that comes out of that, right, and really as we get into the start of this, is that first phase, and it's about knowing what you have, right? I think as we think about how are we going to protect everything, knowing what we have sounds like a simple problem, but I feel like it's never an easy problem. And we see it for small businesses and big businesses alike. For small companies, they may not have been thinking about keeping track of hardware. They might be keeping track of hardware in a spreadsheet, but maybe not software because there were no restrictions for people installing things. At big companies, scale always causes more problems. So those problems quickly extrapolate across the entire organization. So we're left in this place where ultimately we can't even start to protect everything until we know what we have. What are kind of some of those basics that fit into understanding what you have and where it's located?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about foundational controls all the time, and there's no more foundational control than asset inventory management, whether that's your hardware asset inventory or your software asset inventory. Like you said, basically knowing what you have is paramount to being able to secure it. So what we usually do is we help organizations kind of figure out what their footprint looks like from a technology perspective, whether that's operating systems, hosts, devices, network devices, stuff like that. And then also from a software perspective, whether we're talking about just, like applications running on systems, cloud-based applications and web apps, or, even down to the level of firmware when we're talking about kind of the mix between hardware asset management, software asset management, like actually deploying firmware versions to certain devices and hardware. But like you said, this is like foundational. If you don't know what you have in your environment, you can't secure it.
Mm.
And the biggest challenge is like some of our small clients have is they don't know where to begin. They don't know what they need to track about these assets. They don't know they don't have a system really to put them into to make sure that they are able to, have a real time beat on what's in their environment, what's on their networks, what they need to secure, what they need to what they need to go out and look for, security best practices for. And then for our larger organizations, our Fortune 500 companies that have these huge footprints, whether it's a legacy, on-prem co-location environment and now a budding cloud environment, or somebody's moving to the cloud and they've got stuff in migration and transition. Like the problem of tracking what you have and where it is a big problem for everybody. And it's not just like your servers and your blades and your racks and those physical components, right? We're talking about like virtual components, containers, Kubernetes, stuff like that makes this very difficult as people are using elastic services now, spinning stuff up on demand. They're still trying to figure out a way to catch up and track this stuff and know that it's in their environment, how they can track it down in the event that something goes wrong, how they can configure it, monitor it. And that's like really one of the biggest pain point with a lot of our clients in any sort of security realm is just knowing what they have and securing it all. And it's a foundational concept to security configuration management, because security configuration management can't really work effectively if you don't know what you have. So that's like, it's one of the big things we have to tackle first before we start talking about implementing more advanced security configuration management processes, before we talk about developing baselines. And kind of a good segue into baselines, I can talk about that in a second. But from the basic, the most basic concept of inventory management, you got to start with a tool of some sort, whether it's tracking things in a spreadsheet or getting some nice asset management tool like a Big Fix or like a blanking on some off the top of my head, but there's plenty of tools.
ServiceNow, asset
Exactly,
management, all that stuff. Yeah.
ServiceNow, CMDB type stuff with Jira and other tools that support CMDBs. That, like, whether you're using that or manually doing it, you've just got to develop a good process from provisioning and intake to deprovisioning and decommissioning, tracking the things that are in your environment from basically soup to nuts, start to finish, end to end. That's really important. And then the other big concept that we see, the other big issue that we see kind of pervading all of our client space now is tracking software.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that is like the deployment of software on people's laptops and desktops, stuff that people are using, the Adobe Acrobats of the world, the Java runtimes. Java's I think Java is single-handedly responsible for 90% of critical vulnerabilities that are on systems. That's just that's a made-up number. I don't want to get called out for that. But yeah, like being able to track down to the individual host what software is installed, or even in your code bases, what third-party libraries you're using and what software is being deployed to support your web servers or your web application and other dependencies. That stuff is now coming into play. We're seeing a lot of focus now on the third-party libraries, especially because of the amount of vulnerabilities that can be introduced to those. So yeah, software asset management is a big issue right now. It was very simple when we were talking about off-the-shelf software, off-the-shelf like license code code library, stuff like that. But now we're looking at like open source software and third-party open source libraries and things like that people don't have a good handle on in their organization. And all of that contributes to what we consider the security configuration management state.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have an idea of what software is running in your environment, how people have configured the applications or the software, what patch level it's on, what version it's running, what vulnerabilities are associated with it, you're kind of opening yourself up for a lot of risk. And
And
it's
that's a
just
good
one of the
point
things
too,
we
because
gotta
it's not
tackle.
just software on endpoints, right? And you touched on
Yep.
this for a second, even from the hardware perspective. While we think about legacy data centers and first party and even colos, yeah, the cloud is a whole nother aspect that fits into that. It's the hardware and the services and whatever else you're using in the cloud, and
Yep.
all of the software installed there as well. The trick, of course, is some of it you're responsible for and can control, and oftentimes, depending on what cloud provider you're using, some of it you can't, and you're just along
Exactly.
for the ride.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean it's kind of like a good little segue there, right? The knowing what you have is critical to being able to develop configuration baselines. And when we talk about configuration baselines, we're talking about how things are meant to be configured in your operating environment to your organizationally approved standard or your organizationally approved requirements. So meeting those requirements is basically like translating them, whether it's, you guys have to implement something from CIS or DISA to meet a federal requirement, or you have an internal organizational policy like a password policy or something like that that you have to meet. Translating the policy and the requirements and standards into practical security configurations and settings on not only hardware and hosts and devices, but also into software and applications, right? So like let's say you're using, you have a SIEM, a cloud-based SIEM like Splunk or something like that. You have a configuration baseline or a certain set of requirements for cloud apps. So you have to go in and configure Splunk to at least meet your own internal cloud security baseline or cloud requirements. And if you can't do that, you've got to have certain processes in place to mitigate that risk and to document and track those risks. So kind of stepping back to like the point of a configuration baseline. So the baseline state, I want to make sure we talk about two somewhat confusing topics here. Baseline state, right? So the baseline operating state of a system or of an application or of a product is really the approved state of that system or product at one time. So this is the patch level. This is the configuration settings. This is the code base. This is the functionality. This is the baseline state that is approved at this specific point in time.
And I guess
And
historically, right,
yep,
we call that like a gold disk image, but I don't think
right.
that's really even used or applicable as much anymore. But
It,
it's the idea that it's a
yeah.
happy spot where at that point in time you were like, hey, I love everything where this was. The problem is everything keeps moving, so it's good for just that point in time.
Yeah, it is. But one of the things that gets a little bit confusing is we talk about configuration baselines. The configuration baseline of a product system application is an information system or application is the amalgamation of all of the approved configurations, all of the approved states at that point in time, right? So like if no changes were to be made, this is the state that it would reside in, that is approved, that is what we're shipping to customers, that we're presenting to our employees. That is the state, right? So that is your baseline. And then, as things change through change control, we'll talk about that in a little bit. You start adding features, you start updating patch levels, you start changing configurations. Those are changes to your baseline state. Now, the other kind of idea or concept here that gets a little confused with that is baseline configuration checklists or baseline or security configuration checklists, and those are colloquially referred to as baselines, right? We call them baselines, even though it's confused with baseline state. So your baselines, I'm going to use security configuration checklists so we don't
That's fair.
convolute the two terms. But your security configuration checklist here is basically a set of industry best practices or industry standards or something like a CIS benchmark or a DISA STIG that is used by your organization to develop your own checklist for hardening systems components. So either operating systems, applications, network devices, even down to like software tuning like Office 365, Internet Explorer, Chrome. Those checklists provide you with the approved configuration settings, right? So that's something that your organization has to apply to each individual instance of that. If you've got different versions of Chrome running, they've got to all meet that. If you've got different web apps or cloud apps running in your environment, they've all may have to meet a cloud checklist. If you've got Windows 10 running, there's a Windows 10 checklist. Windows 2019, there's a Windows 2019 checklist. Linux, Red Hat, Red Hat 7, there's a Red Hat 7 checklist. And those are what we talk about when we're talking about security configuration checklists or baseline configurations. And that is something that is critically important because as you're working on provisioning new devices on with a specific operating system or new software in your environment or new web apps and third-party applications that you need to secure, those are meant to guide you in uniformly configuring each of those across your environment. And then that becomes part of that larger approved baseline state we were talking about, right? So all the configurations that are supposed to get applied to a Windows 10 laptop, all the configurations that are supposed to be applied to a Windows 2019 server, all the configurations that are supposed to be applied to your cloud security apps, right? Splunk, Wazo, whatever. That stuff, all like in totality, makes up that baseline state. In addition to your code base, the current version of your release or your code base and your some of your like web application stuff, that creates that baseline state. So a lot of that is very difficult to accomplish. A lot of our customers struggle with, well, like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to account for everything in my environment? How am I supposed to know what I need to go create a baseline for, create a baseline checklist for? What am I supposed to do to make sure that everything is secure?
And even the different states that, propagate where someone's gone out for a week on vacation, so their browser has, quote, fallen behind. Keeping everything in sync across the org can be difficult, not just from a technological perspective, but just a logistical perspective as well.
Yeah. So there's plenty of resources to determine what you need to do to secure certain platforms or certain operating systems or certain pieces of software. Two of the best resources, I already mentioned them briefly, are the DISA STIGs, Security Technical Implementation Guides, which are partially publicly available, partially restricted to the government, depending on the version you want to use. But the publicly available ones are more than good enough for what most organizations will need. And then there's the CIS, Center for Internet Security benchmarks. It's not much difference between the two of them. The CIS benchmarks were actually created by a bunch of people that used to work at DISA initially, and now it's a crowdsourced community collaborative initiative where these benchmarks there's like champions for each of the operating systems or each of the device apps or software, and people kind of contribute, and it's almost like a Wikipedia type deal. And it goes through a review process and acceptance.
It covers
and
all the good stuff, right? Definitely, I would say for really both DIS and CIS, right? A lot of them are hardware focused in terms of what they have. So you're going to get all the operating systems. You get phones and servers and laptops and everything in between. Yeah, some software, right, on top of that, popular things, but doesn't always cover everything. But at least it's a good amount of the most used things.
And like where the good thing is, like where CIS has some shortcomings in coverage, DISA makes up for it, and vice versa. So a lot of the things like like VMware ESXi server, right? Or VMware Horizon or Hypersphere, stuff like that. CIS may not have a benchmark for those, but DISA most likely has something, a STIG available, or a security readiness guide, or something available to secure that. And so there's all these resources for figuring out how to secure what a secure state looks like for your exactly for your checklist. There's free resources. Where those don't exist, let's say you've got some edge case where DISA or CS doesn't have something available. The next best step is to create your own using either the guides that the software or hardware publisher or the hardware manufacturer creates and releases to you. Use their best practice guides, use their configuration documentation to develop your own checklist. Figure out what settings are important to you, what your own internal policies are, what your internal requirements are, and then develop a checklist or a security configuration checklist or baseline config that meets your own requirements. All right, there may not be a CIS or a DISA STIG available, so you've got to kind of do the legwork on your own. It's a daunting task, right? And like we said before, if you don't know everything that's in your environment, you don't know what platforms. And when I say platform, I'm talking about operating systems, network OSs. If you don't know what platforms exist in your environment because you don't have a good enough hardware software asset inventory, that's where this becomes a much bigger task. So getting that hardware and software inventory, those inventories in place, and in a mature state enough to where you trust that it's at least accounting for most of the things you have in your environment that are important or have some shred of security risk associated with them. That's paramount to being able to develop your next step, which is that baseline configuration management program or processes. And so once you have an idea of what's in your environment, you can see, okay, I've got Windows 10, I've got Windows 2019, I've got Red Hat Linux 6 and 7, I've got CentOS, I've got oh, I've got this end of life thing I probably got to get rid of, because it always happens, right? There's always like a Solaris 10 server and there's Solaris 11 server or something like that, some legacy tech that people can't get rid of. You see everything that you have, for at least from a hardware perspective. When you're looking at the software inventory, you're seeing, okay, I've got, whatever the latest version of Adobe Pro is running, hopefully no outdated vulnerable versions of that. This version of Chrome is approved. This version of Firefox, I've got Splunk Cloud in my cloud environment. So you can see and everything that you need to develop secure configurations for, and document those for. And it takes a while, right? It takes you have to basically go down the list, and if you don't have anything to start, that's fine. This is where most places start when it comes to security configuration management. It's kind of haphazard to start. Most people aren't worried about these things when they're a fresh startup, or they're a small business trying to win contracts and win work and survive that initial hustle. These aren't things that a lot of people worry about at the beginning. But if there's one thing you should worry about, it's your inventory, because that will set you up for success or failure later on. And if you're going to come back and approach security configuration management and try to do baseline configurations and measure and monitor, starting off with a good solid inventory is your most important battle that you're going to have.
Yeah, definitely from
Yeah.
the hardware and virtual infrastructure, even cloud infrastructure side, to say, hey, we know what's on, we know what's running, and we know what operating system it's on. That's a huge first start.
Yep.
Tackling software inventory, definitely a lot harder, right? Especially if you're not enforcing endpoint restrictions, right? And what people can install or not install, that can be a lot tougher to work through. But at least if you can start with some of the equation, it helps you build that defensible foundation for you to build upon later on and scale that up as needed, and get more granularity in terms of, the level of information, the patch levels,
Yep.
hardware end of life and end of service dates that go along with that.
Yeah, and when you're starting off with developing baseline checklists, security configuration checklists or baseline configs, like, it doesn't have to be a polished, beautiful product to start, right? A lot of the organizations we work with use Excel spreadsheets to start, or they drop them in Confluence, right? They create a Confluence page and they've got a table in there and it's Windows 10 operating system baseline for home desktops, for laptops, for I don't know, third party labor or something like
Mhm.
that. They create 3 individual baselines. They got tables, and then they start documenting settings. And Windows is a little bit easier because you can rely on things like group policy objects and domain policy pushes and stuff like that. So that's probably not a great example, but it can be a very manual process to start, and it likely will be, because you're going to want to go through and document all the configurations you as an organization have to meet from your own policies, your own requirements, either that or from a DISA-STIG or a CIS benchmark. You pull those in and you look in your own environment and say, okay, do we have this in place right now? Yes or no? And you kind of just go down the list, see if the configuration is applied. If not, can you apply it? If you can't, maybe it's something that you can't meet, so it's not something you want to approve for your environment. If it is something you think you can meet in the future, but it just right now you have like some sort of legacy issue or some sort of tech debt that doesn't allow you to enable a certain setting or specific configuration, you can mark that as a deviation or an exception, and just building out that table of approved configurations and what's being applied and what's not meeting this from an asset perspective, is like a huge win and a huge part of the battle.
Yeah, definitely some of those
Yeah,
settings are restrictive, right? It could be things like disabling USB drives, and you
yeah,
have a use case for that, or
right,
even turning on
exactly.
really heavy encryption algorithms that just don't work with some old software that you
Mhm.
have. Finding and documenting those deviations can be a key part of it. Just say, hey, we're trying to meet this baseline. We're about
Yeah.
50% of the way there, but at least you've noted and said, hey, these are the reasons that we can't turn these on. That's still a great first step. So you don't have to be at 100% compliance, because not every company can be. In fact, I would argue probably none are at the end of the day.
No, they aren't. But then again, nobody is expected to be, right. This is your operating baseline, right? So this is your baseline configuration, your security configuration checklist that is supposed to be tailored to your environment. So even when you pull something like a DISA-STIG or a CIS benchmark, and yes, if you are a defense contractor, or you're a cloud system that stores federal information, there are certain expectations from FedRAMP or CMMC or other industry frameworks that you are following, the DISA STIG or CIS benchmark or another NIST 870 approved checklist, that you're following it, right? That your baselines are based off of those things. There is not an expectation that you are 100% meeting those. That it would be unrealistic of any security framework, and security needs to be based in reality. So what you have to do as an organization is determine which of these settings make sense to you, and if you have a compliance obligation to meet a specific requirement that you cannot meet from an organizational perspective, then there's some additional legwork that needs to go into you being able to demonstrate that you've mitigated their risk, that you can show to, whether it's a 3POW auditor from a FedRAMP assessment or a SOC 2 auditor for a SOC 2 Type 2 report. You've got to be able to demonstrate them that you've addressed the risk with not applying a certain configuration that there's an expectation that you are applying from those security frameworks. But at the end of the day, it is really supposed to be tailored to your organization, what you need, what your approved baseline state is, and what that means is like literally buy-in from your technical stakeholders, your security stakeholders, your business stakeholders. That all has to go into the process of defining this approved baseline state. So you obviously can't just run away with security, because then you might divert from the technical requirements or the business requirements. So there's a lot of considerations that go into developing these things. Once you get a little bit more mature in this process, it's going to start manually, because most places don't have the tools they need to do this right off the bat. Some places, you get lucky. Some places are security minded from the beginning, but most places at a startup or small business mentality, they do not have these tools available to support sophisticated baseline configuration management. So the manual process makes sense, but as you get more mature, as you start to streamline this, you get a better understanding of what your baseline state is, what configurations are in place, what platforms, what your inventory looks like. Everything is solidified and galvanized. Then you can move into more advanced means of managing your configurations. So that's some automated baseline management, like stuff through infrastructure as code, for example, whether that's automated provisioning, automated build and deploy, CI/CD pipelines, tools that work in those capacities, the Terraforms, the Ansibles, the chefs, the stuff like that takes YAMLs and code and translates it to configuring stuff on the fly as you're deploying a virtual server or a virtual component.
I was going to say that's a good point, because from an audit perspective, back in the day, you used to have to see configuration scan results for individual endpoints and hardware. But in the world of containerization and CI/CD pipelines, right,
That's hard.
That's impossible to do. So instead, now we look back and we say, hey, within the pipeline, when something gets built, is it pulling from the approved image, right? And is that image reviewed and updated, right, as software requirements or levels are needed and changed? Is it always pulling from that approved image before it goes live and gets pushed out? So same concept, just a different way of approaching it these days.
Yeah, I mean, before time, we used to have people with a gold disk image, like you were saying, right? Like we had an image, and we would build a system, apply the image, and it was a very manual process. Or we had people provisioning servers and co-locations on racks and manually configuring them through sudo or SSH or remote desktop, stuff like that, right? You're manually configuring stuff or applying stuff through GPO where it's supported in the Microsoft realm, right? But nowadays, there's all these sophisticated tools, all these build and deploy tools, all these provisioning tools that you can literally have one, like automated scaling. Elastic services now rely on the ability to automatically deploy a virtual server, right? A virtual host with the configure, or a container with the underlying operating system, the underlying software that's already deployed on it, being configured right out of the box, right out of the gate. Yep. So this stuff is super powerful, but there's always a caveat, right? You're automating a whole bunch of stuff. You accidentally misconfigure something in your YAML or your configuration file that's getting applied to everything that's being built by the automation pipeline. Guess what? That misconfiguration gets deployed everywhere in your environment. You might have a pervasive risk now. Or maybe even it's just one device, got misconfigured, or somebody accidentally changed the YAML outside of change control, and Now something has, a public bucket. You accidentally provisioned a public
Hmm.
S3 bucket that's supposed to be private, which I would never call anybody out for this by name, but this happens way too often. And I think you could probably see somebody in the last 2 years that had a major breach of public information on a public S3 bucket that was supposed to be private, and it was
Hmm.
because of automated configuration management going awry.
Well,
So,
that's the
yeah,
main point in all of this too, right? As we kind of get the next part here, which is how do you monitor and
monitor it.
manage this, right? The idea back in the day and originally was, hey, I'm going to have these scanners that go out and check my configurations regularly, right, across the
Yep.
environment. I'm going to look for my inventory for software and hardware and versions and GPOs and settings and all of that stuff, which is great. If you still have first party data centers and even laptops, right, checking that stuff regularly, very helpful. There's a lot more automated tools now that can do it instantaneously. Agent based tools that are on
Mhm.
endpoints can rapidly check that and constantly make sure it's in compliance. But with some of the stuff we were talking about for CI/CD and containerization stuff that comes with that, you might say, hey, well, if I'm always pulling from this gold image, do I need to be monitoring anymore for stuff that gets deployed? But exactly to your point, Andrew, I think it's still worth it to have that monitoring because if
Mhm.
something does go out that shouldn't go out, you'd at least be notified and saying, hey, we've now opened up this port. This S3 bucket is now publicly available. We've unlocked USBs by accident because somebody messed up the original image. It's probably still a good defense in depth control.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about detective controls and proactive and detective and responsive and uh, in the realm of what we've been discussing, the automation, a lot of the build and deploy stuff and automated provisioning stuff is kind of the proactive control.
Hmm.
It's basically, okay, so we've approved this baseline, we put it into code, and now everything that gets built is going to be built according to this code. That's great if you trust that that code is never that YAML file or whatever the HCL file or whatever the configuration file is that's being used in your infrastructure as code pipeline is not going to be changed either by accident, by a malicious actor, or somebody's just not going to, fat finger something in there by mistake. Because then it's going to propagate, right? It's going to
Yeah.
propagate through the entire environment. Everything that gets all the virtualized components that get built after that, based on that baseline, that config in the code, is going to have that weakness or that issue. So the detective control on top of that is what you were talking about. So monitoring the configuration state. So there's a lot of tools out there. Chef is a good one for build and deploy because it not only does the provisioning portion or the build and deploy portion, the automated portion of that, but it also has like an enforcement mode, which basically watches that the configuration on that host that's deployed. And this is if you're using the agent-based Chef, it watches the configuration. And if there's any change to it, that it looks back to the centralized Chef server and says, okay, this doesn't match what the approved configuration is in here.
Hmm.
It'll change it back, and that's enforcement mode. So it'll enforce it by monitoring and automatically fixing it, remediating it on the fly.
Yeah.
Some tools do that, some better than others. A lot of the automated provisioning tools monitor the hashes
Hmm.
of images that are deployed, AMI, stuff like that. And if the hash changes, it's like, oh, I gotta redeploy this. Like it's going to cause all sorts of havoc. But it's if you run it in that enforcement mode or that hard hold mode, it's going to redeploy that image
Hmm.
because it's detected a change in the hash. And those are really powerful tools. They're also really scary because they can cause all sorts of problems if you actually did mean to make a configuration change and it's not working for some reason and it's pushing it back to the baseline that it thinks is right. That gets a little bit dicey. So a lot of people don't use enforce mode because it can cause a lot of problems.
Yeah.
So you come behind that with another tool, either like a specifically a configuration monitoring tool, something like AWS config, tripwire, stuff like that. That's either sits like as an agent or pulls the configuration from the devices or the application or whatnot, and just alerts, right? So it alerts you that something is wrong, and it gives you the option of either promoting that to the new baseline, making it the new baseline state. You're like, okay, yes, we went through change control. This change was made on this component, and Tripwire or AWS config or another compliance monitoring tool picked it up and alerted us, but it's approved. So we want to make that the new baseline state. So you promote it in the system, and that's where you kind of like track and monitor your baseline now. That's the authoritative source, is that monitoring tool, in addition to whatever documentation you've got, or the code file that's pushing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So those are also very useful in kind of doing spot checks, right? So a lot of the federal frameworks that we work with, real time is great, but they also maybe require periodic submissions or periodic checks on those configurations to demonstrate compliance at a point in
Mm-hmm.
time. And if you're running it on a weekly basis, or if it's in real time mode, you may not be able to generate a report on the fly. So a lot of them offer you like the ability to generate reports and do ad hoc spot checks. So those a lot of those tools are very powerful and support compliance as well.
I think that's
Um,
yeah, and
yeah,
one of the key things, right, where you may have to still provide that point in time audit evidence. Does that
yeah,
mean that audits and compliance frameworks are a little behind? You could argue yes, right,
mhm,
but you can
they are.
sometimes make a compensating argument for, hey, this is why we do things this way, or this is how we can show and prove that.
Yeah,
I think that
yeah,
does take us to one of the other preventative controls that fits into this, which we talked about some of those errant changes
mhm,
within things like the CI/CD pipeline. But I suppose if you're not working in that realm and still deploying things manually out to your environment, change control and sitting down and saying, hey, how are we going to manage the changes to our approved hardware inventory? How are we going to manage changes for our
yeah.
approved software inventory? And classic old school change advisory boards or change control boards, it's still is relevant to this day, making strategic
Yeah.
decisions about what you should and shouldn't do.
Yeah, and one thing I gotta go back to. I kept saying proactive control, and then you said preventative, and it just like ring the bell that
Eh,
I was saying the wrong word. Preventative control. But yeah, for when we talk about change control, and we talk about change control in the context of configuration management, it's one of the key concepts of configuration management. And a lot of people think, change control. Okay, we're talking about like changes to we're making network device changes, we're changing to our firewall rules, we're patching a system, like these very kind of business as usual changes. But nobody ever thinks about things like provisioning new assets, removing new assets, like updates to your asset inventory is needing to go through change control. Because when you think about it, your, like we talked about before, right? Your baseline state, that point in time baseline approved state, includes just the assets that are there at that point in time. It includes all the patch levels. It includes all the firmware, software, OS configuration settings. It includes all of that. So all of that needs to be controlled under change control,
mhm,
or change management. And it is paramount that companies, organizations, especially the ones that we work with, implement like a strong change control workflow and process that supports this. Because one, if you don't have an accounting of the changes that are being made in the system, you have no idea what your baseline state is. If you
mhm,
can't say what has been authorized versus what is not authorized, you don't know if a configuration setting is correct or misconfigured or changed by a threat actor. So change control is basically like your, not only your preventative control, but it's also your audit, right?
mhm.
It's your audit um, trail
Yeah.
for any of the configurations that are applied to a server should be able to be traced back through change control to either an approval or an initial approval, right? Like
Mhm,
a initial baseline approval. So you should be able to track anything that happens in this environment back to a change control ticket or an approval. Um, and obviously, change control, people have different methodologies and different approaches to change control, but there should be like two streams in a change control workflow. You've got your kind of business as usual changes, stuff that happens every day, maybe like small tweaks to configurations, like changing the page file size on something, or changing the log retention size for something because of reaching capacity, versus like your major changes. Like
mhm,
patching kind of falls somewhere in between the two. I always like to include patching more as a major change because of the possibility for things that can go wrong when you're patching stuff. But you have your major changes, right? Like you're adding components, you're removing components, you're migrating stuff, you're migrating workflows in your CI/CD pipeline. You're changing things that have a drastic impact to the system that could either take it offline from an availability perspective, like cause significant downtime, or could, if misconfigured or implemented improperly, could result in a breach of the confidentiality or the integrity of the data that
mhm,
resides in the system. So having two workflows, one for business as usual, low impact, low risk changes, and then another that is for specifically like higher risk stuff, makes sense. And
mhm,
I wish organizations would really do this. Um, Beyond that, there is the need for like a change control board, a specific group of uh, of people of stakeholders that are basically assigned with the task of reviewing those major changes and approving them. It should be multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, and probably people from more of the management type roles than the lower people in the weeds type roles.
Yeah. That is all great stuff. The good news is, too, from our side, we've actually recently authored a white paper outlining this whole process in detail, giving you some guides and updates and ideas to put into it. So we recommend you log online to our website at www.hivesystems.io, and you'll be able to find a copy and a link to that there. We'll also make that available in the show notes today as well. From our side, that is all the time we have today. I want to thank Andrew for his expertise and thoughts on configuration management. I found it very interesting for us to think about both how legacy and modern organizations are tackling this problem. It is not an easy problem to solve, but it is something that you can chip away at, reduce the risk of the areas that have the most risk first for your organization, and work your way on down. You won't be able to ever get quite to 100%, but you can at least know where your gaps are and accept that risk. Make strategic decisions about what is and isn't worth it to your organization. We hope you'll share this episode, though, with your colleagues and organization leaders who may also be struggling with this or overlooking it so that they can take care of this key risk today. We want to thank you for joining us, and as always, our experts here at Hive Systems help make your cybersecurity journey more approachable. So please reach out to us anytime by contacting us at www.hivesystems.io. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can be alerted about our next episode by going to www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Next month, we've got a great episode on the future of cybersecurity risk assessment, so make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to our channel at www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react. Thank you.